Thank you, Brad. It's my honor and my great pleasure to introduce this evening a tremendous champion for liberty, someone who has brought the ideas of liberty to millions of people around the globe. I first became aware of the persuasive power of Johan Norberg when I read a somewhat clunky translation of his fabulous book, In Defense of Global Capitalism. And I said, we have to bring this out in a better translation and bring it to the English-speaking world. And since then, we've published it in Chinese and Russian and Arabic and many other languages. But the first time I saw him in action, not merely as a writer, but as a communicator, was when we were both at a conference at Georgetown University. And it was a pretty left-of-center audience, overwhelmingly female, young women, mostly pretty clearly left-oriented. And he did something magical. He managed to explain to them the idea of private enterprise, of the business corporation, of property rights, of mutually beneficial exchange, without using any buzzwords, but in a way that they understood it. And I was simply in awe of his ability. But also, they wrote down their questions on slips of paper and passed them in. And I noticed another element of his persuasive power, which was the first question that was posed was, are you single? And fortunately, his wife was there, and she very quickly pointed out, no, he is not single. He is a great communicator, and he has since gone on to produce a stream of books in Swedish and English, and then other translations, articles, and also communications through television. His latest production is coming to a television screen near you through the work of the Free to Choose Network. It's called Economic Freedom in Action, Changing Lives. And Johan reports on 4 countries whose people have benefited from economic freedom. He also interviews the authors of the Economic Freedom of the World report from our wonderful Canadian partner, the Fraser Institute, and explains these concepts in terms that most people can understand. It'll be broadcast on public television in the United States and then distributed to thousands of schools through the Free to Choose network. I'm also happy to say that Atlas has begun cooperation with the Free to Choose network to produce another documentary with Johan, and if you're interested, you can talk to me about that later, or Bob Chittister or James and Maureen Tusty, who are here from the Freedom to Choose network. So we're going to share a short clip from that video. I'd like to cue the video now.
When I escaped from North Korea, I was 27. I crossed the Jangbaekhyun River into China. There were too many North Korean security guards patrolling there. So I walked the mountain trails at night with no food for a week. I went hiding during the day and walked the trails at night again. The North Korean defectors have no relatives in the south. They are mostly single and have no property. So borrowing money is the hardest thing for them, and also the most important thing.
Daesung meets regularly with various owners to discuss business issues, cultural differences, and basic moral support. North Korean refugees have many challenges. They often change their names in order to avoid arrest and reprisals to their relatives who are still living in the north. Then they find they are not so easily integrated into the south. Ok-bun and her family escaped from North Korea 2 years ago.
I escaped with my husband, myself, and 2 sons. Mr. Kim helped us with loans. That was how we got started.
I expect that someday North Korea will open her doors. When it does happen, the former North Korean defectors will be experienced business people backed with funds. then we'll be able to play our roles in the reconstruction of North Korea.
Daesung's venture capital company has funded 29 small businesses to date.
그래서 지금 형제들이 와 있는데 형제들도 사업을
My sisters are all engaged in running a business of their own.
그 우리 부모님 산소도 가보고
We all want to visit our parents' gravesite someday and want to play a role in helping North Korea become a wonderful country.
Newfound economic freedom is changing lives.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Johan Norberg.
Thank you, my dear, dear friends. And thank you, Tom, for that introduction. It is a great pleasure being here. Sophia, my wife, and I, who was probably present during that event where Tom was to set things straight, we're delighted to be here at the Atlas Freedom Dinner. And when we look around at all of you, old friends, new friends, and some future friends, we kind of think that this must be the greatest concentration of potential, intellectual potential for more freedom in the world since Anthony Fisher sat there all alone in a fighter plane over Britain contemplating how to set the world free. And we are here in the great city of New York, the symbol of freedom, the city of progress, the city of resilience, and, well, the city of Bill de Blasio nowadays as well. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Are there any real New Yorkers here tonight? Any? Yeah? It hurts me to point this out, but it seems like you were the only ones not voting for the guy and his left-wing populism. And that kind of got me thinking about a couple of things. It got me thinking about that at times, the struggle for freedom seems a bit hopeless. It seems like it's a bit in vain. We are repeating the same kind of arguments, but we're watching the same kind of mistakes being repeated again and again. And that is the subject of my remarks tonight. It's easy to despair when we don't see short-term progress. Should we? Well, should we? You know, we tried Bill de Blasio in Sweden for about 3 decades or something like that. And the result was that we got the most libertarian generation in Sweden's history as a reaction to the failed government policies at the time. And they quickly, for about 2 decades, they've been sort of in charge intellectually and sometimes in government as well to give Sweden tax cuts, deregulation, privatization, school vouchers, private pension accounts, and so on. Because the only thing that can rival the populist appeal of someone who promises to fix everything is the public hostility to him when he fails to deliver. And you know, the only thing less popular today in our world, in the United States and in Europe, than a capitalist or a banker is actually a politician. You know, Angus Deaton, the professor who is constantly doing research on well-being and happiness, he has looked at polls where people have to answer questions about both the world we live in and about their own well-being. And he points out that people now dislike politicians so much that it affects their overall well-being, even to think of them. And I quote him, "People appear to dislike politics and politicians so much that prompting them even to think about them has a very large downward effect on their assessments of their own lives." End of quote. When a person is being asked about his opinion of elected officials today, it has a negative effect on his well-being that is only a little less than the effect of him being unemployed. Distrust is the result when governments fail to uphold the promise of doing impossible things, such as designing a website or other impossible things like that. You know, Vice President Joe Biden recently put it in despair, "I don't understand why everybody is so mad at me." But I know why. It's because we've come to know you, Mr. Vice President. The best argument against big government has always been big government in action. And this doesn't translate necessarily into libertarian politics, classical liberal ideas, and I know it's frustrating when we're in some respects going backwards, when we see more surveillance, more fences, more tariffs, more rules, higher taxes, monetary policy out of control, Obamacare out of control. It's easy to think that the work we are doing in the freedom movement doesn't have any effect. But when I think about that, that's when I think about a remark from one of my favorite authors, Evelyn Waugh, author of Brideshead Revisited and other masterpieces. When, you know, he was a practicing Catholic, but he was a ruthless guy. He was brutal to his friends and family and so on. So at one point, someone asked him, "Why is this that you're so nasty despite being a believer?" And then he said, "You have no idea how much nastier I would be if I was not a Catholic." And that sounds a bit like an excuse, but I think it was correct, and I think that was an important point. And let me spell out the obvious parallel to our situation here tonight. You have no idea how much nastier the United States and the world would be without the work that you're doing for freedom every day. Yes, I am young enough to want everything at once. But I'm also old enough to understand that my fight has not been in vain, even if I don't get it all. If I get much more than I otherwise would have. And we must realize that our world could have been in a much worse shape had it not been for the arguments made on behalf of liberty. A case in point are all the statist dogs that did not bark after the financial crisis. Everybody sort of assumed that we would have a global backlash against free trade, isolationist economies, just like we had in the 1930s. That did not happen. Everybody assumed that we would have a huge re-regulation of business all over the world, and with some exceptions, and the financial industry being a case in point, we have not seen that. And actually, the World Bank, in their Doing Business Index, they saw that the world had never seen as many pro-market reforms as it did in 2008 and 2009. And we have no experience, we don't have the experience we thought we would have, of wild leftist populism that most of us expected, with some exceptions. Even though there is much talk about this, I think the great question to ponder is why we haven't seen a stronger anti-capitalist force throughout the world in these last few years. Yes, all of us want to go to heaven, but avoiding hell is quite an achievement nonetheless. And I am sure that at least some of that is the result of people here making it possible to make the case for freedom all over the world. We must not forget what we're up against and the history of it all. The most optimistic school of history in classical liberal thought, the Whig interpretation of history, is something that was once, well, it still is derided for being too optimistic, for promising progress all over the world. But the Whig interpretation of history did not promise that freedom would always win out. That was not its perspective on progress. Lord Macaulay, the father of this Whig interpretation of history, said that we will always have war. We will always have taxes, prohibitions, and protectionism with us. The realistic goal, he thought, was to reduce and stifle it as much as possible so that it would be possible for people to create faster than governments can squander. So in a way, the classical liberal goal was always to hold the opponents back so much that we could make the world safe for progress. And I think that is still our goal. We don't have to defeat our opponents completely to ensure progress. We only have to restrain them so much that individualists and innovators are allowed breathing space and space to act to change our world. And every time we restrain the statist, the slightest, every time we stop them from laying their hands on even more, every time we block a new law or a new regulation, the more we buy time for progress, for innovation, for technological change, and for human achievement. But wait, it gets even better than that. Even though we can see problems in the short run, the overall broad global trend is still the same. We are winning. More than 20 years ago, Milton Friedman wanted to end a speech on a positive note. So he said that he recently read that an English newspaper 200 years ago had tried to measure the freedom in the world at that time. And it came to the conclusion that slaves outnumbered free men 23 to 1. But when Milton Friedman spoke, the ratio had fallen to 3 to 1. And Friedman pointed out, we are still very far from our goal of a completely free world, but on the scale of historic time, that is amazing progress, more in the past 2 centuries than in the prior 2 millennia. Well, since Milton Friedman spoke, by his standards, the ratio has fallen again. It's now 1 to 1. We've seen more progress in these last 2 decades than in the 2 millennia before that. And the same goes for economic freedom. When we look at the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, we see that since 1980, the world average of economic freedom has moved from 5.3 to 6.9 on a 10-point scale. And to put that into perspective, it means that if the world of 1980 had magically appeared here tonight, the only person who would celebrate it would probably be Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela's president, who would have offered that world a membership of the Bolivarian alliance, because that was as unfree as the world was at that time. The world average of 1980 would have ranked as number 144 out of 153 countries. The world went from where India was at that time to where Taiwan was at that time. And the ongoing discussion in most important countries today is still about how to liberalize further. Not automatically, and it's not an easy process, but because brave people are making the case for freedom locally in their own countries every day. So where are we? We are at the point, in the moment in mankind's history, when more people than ever lead longer lives than ever and have more freedom than ever to think, to talk, to create, to produce and trade, to make life better for themselves and for their families. So it's no coincidence that the world is also making faster progress than ever before. Have you read development statistics lately? Have you looked at the World Bank indicators of progress, or Gapminder, or Cato's New Human Progress website? Well, you should, because it is, to borrow an expression, like being beaten over the head by a rainbow. We've never seen progress as fast and as broad as we're seeing today in our world. It took mankind 100,000 years to achieve the GDP per capita of 1980. It took merely 30 years to do it again, to double that level. Since 1980, 700 million people left extreme poverty, even though the world population grew by more than 2 billion. And it happened in the places, in the countries that liberalized the most. You must really dislike mankind not to be incredibly excited by this development. In a way, this is bigger than the Industrial Revolution. What was the Industrial Revolution? 200 million people doubling their average income in 60 years. Well, 2 billion people just did the same thing in 15 years. 10 times as many in a fifth of the time that it took during the Industrial Revolution. In a way, this is 50 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, the results are in. Freedom is awesome. And you will always know, you and I, we will always know that we were there and helped progress along a little bit along the way. And whenever I hear someone challenging this, saying, this is just numbers, this is just statistics, this doesn't constitute real progress for the world, for our living standards, I think of two different news items that I read on the same day in August 2010. One about one of the biggest composers of all time, the other one about one of the biggest elephants of all time. Story number one. Mozart, who died in Vienna in 1791, 35 years old, may have died of complications from a sore throat, caused by a bacterial infection, scientists conclude. Story number two. A 48-year-old Thai elephant has been fitted with a permanent artificial leg 10 years after losing a limb. And I think as long as we give elephants better care than the greatest composers of all time got 200 years ago, we are doing something right. And I don't think even Obamacare will change that. What I'm saying here is not that there are no threats. We know that there are. And some of them are vicious and downright evil. We have always said that the anti-capitalist zero-sum mentality and a focus on taking rather than creating would set group against group, man against man. And we can see that today, how groups are just hoping for the next crisis to be able to find scapegoats and blame the rich, blame the Jews, blame the foreigners and the immigrants. They're hard at work and they are influential. What I am saying is that there is hope. The battle for freedom is being waged in more places than ever, with smarter people than ever, with better arguments than ever. There is hope, and you are creating that hope. You, donors to Atlas, partners to Atlas around the world, just heard that just this last year, 29 new think tank partners arrived. Atlas now has 470 different partner think tanks in 83 different countries. And that gives me hope. I meet a lot of young people who have decided to devote their life, or at least parts of their life, to freedom. And nothing gives me more hope than that. Recently, I met a young woman in a small European country, and I asked her about her story, what convinced her. And she answered with a famous quote, historical one, "Man's mind, once stretched by a beautiful idea, never regains its original dimension." And that beautiful idea was freedom. She had read one of the books that Atlas is promoting around the world. She had met with Tom Palmer, and I'm not just saying that because you gave me such a great introduction up here, but that helped. That book, that meeting convinced her about these ideas. And she started to recruit students for this course and started to teach others these values. I have tried to do other things, she told me. She tried to go into the legal professions, but my mind hasn't regained its original dimension. This is too important. Too much is at stake. We have too much to win, and we have too much to lose if we fail. So I just can't stop. I have been asked to present tonight's toast to freedom, and I gladly accept it because it combines two of my favorite ways of stretching the human mind, freedom and alcohol. And because I'm now a father of two very independent kids, I rarely get the chance to tell people when to eat and drink. I would like to use this opportunity. So, in honor of freedom and the work that all of you are doing to stretch people's minds, I suggest that we raise our glasses. And I would personally like to devote this toast to Alexander and Alicia, our two kids, Sophia's and my two kids, who are here in New York as well this week, and for the work you are doing to make sure that they can lead a life, grow up in a world where they can still be very independent-minded indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, to freedom. Thank you.